Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You've heard about it on the news. You've seen dramatic portrayals of it during police and courtroom movies and TV shows. But what is it really like to go through jury duty? It is, of course, an important civic duty that Canadians may be asked to carry out. However, many of us may never get the initial outreach, and most of us will not actually be picked to sit with peers and decide the outcome of a civil or criminal court proceeding. One person who did is actually a colleague of mine who decided to write on citynews.ca about his experience going through the jury process from start to finish in order to help all Canadians understand what it's like. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with City News reporter Nick Westoll, who's based out of Toronto. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm glad I can shed some light on this.
All right, before we get to the questions, though, there are things you can and can't say. Why don't you walk us through that?
Yeah, so under Canadian law, a juror cannot discuss anything about deliberations. So after the jury hears all the exhibits, hears all the submissions from the lawyers, and the jury gets what's called a jury charge. So basically, it's a huge list of instructions and things to consider, not consider. So anything after that point, it's prohibited by law from talking about. So naturally, I won't get into that. Also, in terms of the trial I sat on, because it's still ongoing and there are, there will be a sentence at some point, I'm not really getting into the specifics of the trial I sat on. What I will say is there were multiple charges and it was a criminal matter.
Thanks, Nick, for at least laying out the ground rules for us here. But why don't we start from the start? Walk me through the initial stages of how you found out that the justice system wanted you for jury duty, and how did things kind of unfold before you ended up sitting in a courtroom to help decide the fate of a case?
I got a survey through the mail from the Ministry of the Attorney General, and basically you just fill out all your particulars about, where you live and confirming your address, your profession, just basic stuff about you. And, when I put in, I'm a journalist, I thought, okay, well, somebody's going to see this and they're going to want me to serve on a jury. So I completed it, sent it back. I thought, okay, that's it. I'm not going to hear anything. Well, that wasn't the case. So at the end of winter of this year, I got a note saying you've been summoned for jury duty in a couple of months. I thought, okay, well, again, I don't think I'm really going to be able to sit on this because just by virtue of my work. And now I don't cover courts often. It's, it's especially nowadays, it's more of a seldom thing, but still it was just hard to wrap my head around that they would want a journalist there. So anyway, so I showed up for jury duty, but so did literally hundreds of others. Like the lineup was out the door and around the corner. And this is a lineup you go through airport style screening, right? It's very official. So once you get in the courthouse, you report to a certain part and you have to sit there and then you check in. They will make you watch a public service video to talk about why it's important to do jury duty. You're lucky looking around the room. If 20% watched the thing, I'd be interested. Everybody was either buried in their laptops or their phones, or there were even a few people trying to sleep a bit because it was an early start. It was 8:30 in the morning. So there's a lot of hurry up and waiting when it comes to the jury screening. I learned that firsthand. And you don't know if it's a civil case or a criminal case until you're actually in the courtroom. And so you wait for what's called a jury panel to be called. You are escorted down by court staff. You sit in the courtroom. And then at the front, there's the court registrar and who sits in front of the judge. That person's a key official, I've learned in all this. So the judge enters, explains basically what the case is about, as well as a list of the defendants or, if it's a civil case, like who's involved on both sides, the lawyers for both sides, as well as a list of witnesses. They throw that out there in case you know anybody, and then because naturally that would that would create a conflict. So you hear that brief blurb, and then the court registrar, she spins this wooden drum, It's almost like, imagine if you're at a bingo game and they're pulling numbers out. It literally looks like that and churning around. And so one by one, they pull out slips of paper, and on each slip it has a juror number, the community where they live, and their profession. And that's how you get called up.
Okay, so you don't have lawyers sort of questioning you and deciding whether or not they want you?
So you do get that. And I've learned there are two very different procedures. So for civil cases, so where one party is suing another one for damages, first of all, the jury for that is smaller. You only need 6 jurors plus 1 or 2 alternates. And the lawyers on both sides have what are called preemptory challenges, meaning they can ask for you to be dismissed without any justification. They may look at you and feel, okay, you're maybe not right for this case. They may hear about your profession and say, okay, that may not help your side. And what's interesting about that is I sat through 2 different civil case screenings. I wasn't called up for either one, but in one of the cases, the lawyers were so eager to get potential jurors off, they exhausted all those preemptory challenges. So at that point on, if somebody was deemed eligible to serve by the judge, then they would go there and there's nothing the lawyers could do. Criminal, it's a bit different. So for a criminal case, you need 12 jurors plus 1 or 2 alternates. And again, same procedure. The court registrar pulls out that slip of paper that I talked about, and then you go down sequentially. And the first group is given a questionnaire to fill out. So they ask you a bit more about yourself. They ask you questions sort of related to the charges that are before the court, and if you've had any sort of experience there. And then, depending on the circumstance, they will ask you if you can set aside bias or any preconceived notions. And there's a particular line of screening that goes with that. So one by one, in the order you're drawn, you're called in. The judge will review the questionnaire and then potentially ask you questions. And then what happened most of the time is jurors were kicked out for a few minutes and then brought back in. I will tell you, it's very hard to impanel a jury. So I was near the end of a first group of 20, and I was 17. And for all the people in front of me, only 2 people were picked for jurors. The rest were either discharged for various reasons, be it financial, maybe there's a medical reason they couldn't see or hear properly, or they have a profession. There's a number of professions in Ontario that are exempt from jury duty. So I saw instances of that. So there's a multitude of reasons why somebody could be excluded from a criminal case. But being a journalist, I can tell you that wasn't one of the reasons, at least in my case.
Well, it's interesting as well because as a journalist, you're supposed to remain unbiased and look at all the facts. So that would be a notch in your favor. But also, you're supposed to try to avoid making judgments unless they come from official authorities like the courts. So did it feel kind of weird for you to be in this position?
In some respects, it almost betrayed every instinct I had as a journalist to not Google, right? Because as soon as you get there, they say, do not look at any of the laws pertaining to the case. Do not look up the accused or any of the participants. Stay as neutral and removed from it as possible. And tell that to a journalist. Good luck getting them to try to stay within those confines. But I did. So it was jarring in a sense, at least for me. Anyway, but I understand why that's the case, right? Because you have to go in and look at facts. And in fact, some of the research I've done after the case was done, there's a specific line that talks about juries are judges of facts. The presiding judge is a judge of the law. So what that means is like whoever's presiding over the case, they deal with all the legal aspects. You're purely supposed to look at the facts and whether you believe some, all, or none of them. And that's really the crux of the mission of being a juror.
More on the big story with City News reporter Nick Westoll about his experience in jury duty in just a moment. What is it like actually being in the jury when the court case begins? You actually spoke with an Ontario Superior Court Justice, the Honourable Justice James Strabopoulos. Here's what he had to say.
Trials don't unfold the way, an episode unfolds on Law & Order. They're a lot messier. And getting the evidence before the jury or the judge, if it's a judge alone trial, is time consuming.
So in your experience, is it like they portray in Hollywood, or is it like the justice says, is it much more boring in real life?
No, it is so far removed from what you see on television or the movies. And there aren't any gotcha moments or any like high drama moments. A lot of it's very procedural. And I will say, as part of a trial, a lot of the things that the lawyers try to bring up, those are sorted out before a jury even enters the courtroom. So a lot of things, is it admissible, is it not admissible? That's all sorted out before the jury shows up. So there shouldn't be any real, like surprises or procedural gotcha moments. And quite frankly, I didn't see that when I was there. Now, is it boring? I would say it's not boring because I cannot stress this point enough. The enormity of the task that you feel, this deep, deep sense of responsibility to A, get it right, but B, make sure you're impartial and making sure that you don't have any sort of bias that's sort of guiding you through this. Uh, I took it so seriously, and how could you not, right? It's just such a formal setting. And just to reinforce how formal it is, you are almost treated like a judge. You get access to private areas. So where the jury room is, where they're kept outside of court, that's steps away from where judges have their offices. You are escorted to and from the courtroom by jury staff. When you walk in, and you always have to stay in the same order, you get the same seat throughout the trial. Everybody stands and looks at you. You are treated like a judge. And I remember the first time walking in there, as soon as the trial got going, which was the day after the jury was impaneled, um, seeing everybody stand up and look at you, I could feel, the hairs on my neck sort of stand up because it added to the gravity of the situation.
And are you also kept from all outside communication, put up in a hotel, constricted only to that jury room throughout the whole proceeding? How does that unfold?
It's really in two stages. So the first stage is day-to-day trial business, right? You're there for a trial. So you show up at a set time. And, I should point out the court staff in Ontario, the ones I dealt with, I have never met a more dedicated group of civil servants. Like, they went so far out of their way to make sure you're comfortable, get you anything you need. So like, you'd show up in the morning, they would take a drink order, or do you want a snack, or is there something we can do to get you to help you get through the day? And that happened every day without fail. And then once all the jurors show up from coming from home, you're escorted as a group to the jury room. A guard stands in front of that room. You cannot wander about, right? And even jury staff will check the hallways. If somebody's in custody, for instance, they don't want the jury to see that and have that image in their head of somebody maybe in shackles getting to and from, right? So I can understand why they would want to make sure the hallways are clear. You don't see the judge in the back halls either. And if you're walking around the courthouse, think about it. It's a big public open space. So if you have an accused or their lawyers or families of anybody involved or the witnesses, there were instances we had that happen. Or I remember seeing, one of the lawyers involved, and I would like physically turn my head. I was going to get on the elevator. I stepped back, waited for them to get on the elevator and go, and then I got the next one, right? It's just, there's a lot of things that you're told to avoid any sort of contact, right? Because if there is contact, that's potentially grounds for a mistrial, right? So there's a lot of care given to making sure the jury is separated from everything. But in terms of living your daily life during trial, unless you're sequestered, you're going home, right? You're going home for dinner, you're riding the train, there's nothing really special about it. It's like you're just going about your day as if you're working. You are told, do not talk about the case with anyone, family, friends. And, that's a bit hard too, right? Because it would be nice to bounce some things off ideas. No. Throughout the trial process, I kept to myself. I didn't talk about anything. Now, when you're sequestered, that's a different story. So I mentioned earlier that jury charge. So when the jury gets its final instructions from the judge and retires, everybody lines up, and one by one, you have to give over your cell phones, smartwatches, tablets, even Kindle books, like the ebooks. Those had to go in. Anything capable of getting data had to be turned over to court staff, and it was locked up. At that point, you are under their, for lack of a better term, care and control. So they, again, stay outside the doors. The door is locked. They will unlock it. If you need something, you knock on the door. At the end of the day, you are escorted by them to the hotel you are staying at. You do not get to go home once you are sequestered. You must stay as a group. The hotel rooms themselves, let's just talk about that. They take out so much. There are no clock radios. There are no phones. The cables from the TVs were stripped off. Anything, again, that could get a shred of data was removed. And what's interesting is in my case, I had a microwave in my room. If I didn't have that microwave, I wouldn't know what time it was. Everybody was told they would have to knock on the door, ask the on-duty jury constable, what time is it, if you didn't have a manual watch. I had a puzzle book to try to keep busy, Sudoku and things like that. The first night, I lasted maybe 5-10 minutes, and I couldn't do it. My mind was just thinking about everything I heard throughout the trial, thinking about deliberations. And I kid you not, I looked at that microwave clock, and then 3 hours later, I was still thinking about the case.
I know you can't talk about how the deliberations are conducted when you're trying to reach a verdict, but maybe you can tell me how difficult it is to make a unanimous decision as a jury?
Yeah, and again, under Canadian law, it cannot talk about anything related to deliberations or anything that happened in that back room. There is an exception, though. If jurors are struggling for mental health reasons, and this is only in recent years, Parliament made an amendment to the criminal code to allow people to talk to mental health professionals, registered mental health professionals, to get some debriefing and some support afterwards. But I will say this about deliberations. Imagine sitting with 11 strangers. Say you're on a train or somewhere and a discussion gets going. I mean, just like anything in life, you have people who've come to these discussions through different lived experiences or through, their interpretation of a set of straight out facts. And everybody's going to look at that differently. So, I'll just leave it to your imagination, which way, there's 100 different ways that it can all go down.
Yeah, it's hard enough to choose toppings for a pizza as a family, let alone decide with strangers the outcome of a court case. But you did touch on something that I wanted to talk about, and that is the immense emotional pressure on a juror. I mean, you're deciding the fate of an accused, and your decision would have an impact on potential victims. That must weigh on you.
Incredibly. And I think that was just such a reality check as part of this process. I'm going to step back a bit. When I did end up on the jury, I thought, wow, this is great. I'm a journalist. I'm going to learn so much about the court process. This will help me, with my job and just help me better understand courts. Because as we mentioned earlier, what you see on TV is just inevitably so far removed. So I thought it was helpful. But as it went on, the gravity of the situation really sunk in and, profoundly affected me, because someone's liberty is at stake. You don't set the sentence, of course, but your decision has very real implications, but not only just for the accused. Also, there are people who say they've been victims that are seeking justice from the justice system. Also you are contributing to the administration of justice and how things are going. There are multiple different stakeholders who rely on your decision. It's not just the accused. And by the way, the accused, it's up to them whether they want a jury trial or a judge alone trial. So it's not as if a jury is forced on them. It is totally up to them to choose that. But by the end of it, I could barely speak. I physically broke down in tears. It was all this confluence of factors that just impacted, being sequestered and, weighing all the evidence that came forward in the trial, hearing about everything. I felt this heavy burden on my shoulders. It profoundly affected me.
So what did it feel like when the verdict was finally read in court, whatever that verdict was, and what happens after?
I ended up being the foreperson for our jury. As foreperson, regardless of trial, you have to stand up. You have a list of all the charges. You have to say guilty or not guilty. Or if there's no finding on one, i.e. if you can't have a unanimous finding, you got to convey that to the court as well. But, for 2 minutes, every set of eyes in that courtroom is on you. That just adds to the weight of the seriousness, right? And again, I can't stress that point enough. And even just reading out the verdict, it reinforced it for me. Just, someone's liberty is at stake. You hope you made the right decision based on the facts as they were presented to you. It's something that weighed on me, and again, I can't stress it enough how hard it is. And not knowing that beforehand, before all this started, like there's very few first-person accounts of what it's like to do jury duty service. I tried to Google before I even got it going, and I found this random Reddit thread where people were anecdotally sharing things, but I just wish I knew everything that would be a part of this to help me better prepare me to be a juror. And not having that, I think, contributed to the emotional state I was in at the time. So writing a very in-depth reflection as best as possible really helped me process all those feelings I struggled with afterwards.
And what was the compensation like? Because people are asked to take time away from their regular jobs, whether they be part-time, full-time, it doesn't really matter. They have to go do their civic responsibility. How are they compensated for that?
Under the law in Ontario, the first 10 days of jury service, you are technically entitled to nothing. And on day 11 through to day 49, if you have to serve on a jury that long, it's $40 a day. If you are still on a jury on the 50th day or later, then the compensation goes up to $100 a day. But think about that for 2 weeks. If your employer doesn't pay you, you technically could be in a real financial situation there. Now, in speaking with the justice for this story, he said, judges have discretion about doing stipend awards, and a lot of them are opting to do that because just recognizing, this is a tough economy, right? You're asking people to go without any sort of payment for 2 weeks and then $40 a day afterwards for weeks on end. Think about it. You got to pay to get yourself to court. You've got expenses and bills. All of that doesn't stop. The only protection you're afforded as a juror in Ontario is that you can't be fired from your job. Speaking with Justice Strabopoulos for this interview, he was saying that, this is potentially something that really needs to be looked at. And that's a question, I've taken the Ontario government. I hope to get some sort of answer on that about other jurors going forward, is like, what can be done to better protect them? So financial means aren't a reason for being excused from jury duty. People need to have some sort of base compensation just so they do not fall behind for trying to do their civic duty.
Yeah, it's important to pay the groceries and pay the rent as well. And you dive deeper into this in part 2 and part 3 of your series on this, where you look at why juries matter to the accused, the alleged victims, and the administration of justice, as well as looking at the current jury system and the calls for reforms, as you were discussing there, including improved compensation. So if you want to check out all 3 parts of this series on jury duty, head to citynews.ca. Nick, thank you so much for sharing your experiences on this, informing the public on what it's like to go through jury duty and talking with me today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks so much for actually pursuing this and doing a podcast on it.
And that was Nick Westoll, a City News reporter out of Toronto, speaking with me about his experience in jury duty. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.